What begins as hidden office affairs, stolen glances, late emails, private lunches, can spiral into obsession, betrayal, and deadly rage. When ambition, jealousy, and forbidden desire collide, the workplace becomes the backdrop for unthinkable violence. These are the 5 most disturbing secret office affairs that ended in death. On the humid night of 24 October 1984, the quiet routine of a Singapore housing estate was shattered by a crime that would soon grip the nation. Tan Teek Sia, a 39-year-old banker employed by American Express and better known to colleagues as Frankie Tan, was returning home from work, unaware that his final moments were already set in motion. As he approached his residence, 4 men emerged from the darkness. Within minutes, Tan was overpowered, dragged into the shadows, and strangled to death. There were no screams loud enough to draw attention, no witnesses bold enough to intervene. By the time help could have arrived, it was already too late. The grim discovery was made by the person closest to him, his wife, Lee Chi-po. She found his lifeless body and promptly alerted the police, presenting herself as a grieving spouse caught in a sudden tragedy. But behind her composed exterior lay a devastating truth. The murder she reported was one she had known about all along. As investigators peeled back the layers of the case, what initially appeared to be a brutal street attack revealed itself as something far more intimate and disturbing, a carefully planned crime of passion, rooted in betrayal, infidelity, and years of domestic abuse. Frankie Tan's death was not random. It was the violent culmination of a marriage poisoned by his repeated extramarital affairs and a private life marked by cruelty behind closed doors. According to court evidence, Tan's behavior had pushed his wife to emotional and psychological breaking point. Humiliated by his affairs and trapped in an abusive relationship, Lee Chi-po found an unlikely ally in Vasavan Sathiadu, Tan's adoptive brother. Together, the two began to discuss what they saw as the only escape from a life of fear and degradation. What started as whispered resentment eventually hardened into a deadly resolve. Rather than confronting Tan or seeking legal recourse, the pair chose vengeance. They paid 3 Thai construction workers to carry out the killing, promising them money in exchange for silence and obedience. The plan was simple, brutal, and irreversible. On that October night, the hired men lay in wait, ambushing Tan as he returned home, ending his life in a swift and merciless act. The aftermath of the murder led to one of Singapore's most closely watched trials. Over 45 days, the courtroom became a stage where guilt, denial, and desperation played out in full view of the public. The 3 hired assailants were arrested, along with Lee Chi-po, and charged in connection with Tan's death. A 4th man, allegedly involved in the attack, vanished and remains a fugitive to this day, his role frozen in mystery. Facing the gallows, the 3 accused killers attempted to distance themselves from the crime. They challenged the validity of their confessions, claiming they had been coerced. In a last attempt to escape the death penalty, they pleaded diminished responsibility, arguing that their intention was not to kill Tan, but merely to assault him. They shifted blame onto the missing 4th man, insisting he alone had tightened the fatal grip around Tan's neck. The court was unconvinced. The lower division of the Supreme Court of Singapore rejected their defenses outright. The evidence, the planning, and the coordinated execution of the attack all pointed to deliberate murder. The 3 men were found guilty and sentenced to death. Their appeals were later dismissed by the Supreme Court's higher division, sealing their fate. On 23 October 1992, almost exactly 8 years after the murder, the sentences were carried out, bringing a grim end to their involvement in the case. Lee Chi-po's fate, however, was markedly different. Tried separately, she avoided the gallows and was instead convicted of manslaughter, receiving a 7-year prison sentence. The court acknowledged the exceptional and sympathetic circumstances surrounding her actions, years of abuse, emotional torment, and betrayal that had driven her to participate in the plot against her husband. While the law did not absolve her, it recognized her as both a conspirator and, in many ways, a victim. The murder of Frankie Tan remains one of Singapore's most haunting true crime stories, a chilling reminder of how secrets within a marriage, especially those born in betrayal and violence, can escalate into irreversible tragedy. What began as an illicit affair and domestic cruelty ended in 4 lives destroyed, a family torn apart, and a crime that still echoes decades later. The courtroom at the Old Bailey fell silent as 2 young sisters broke down in tears, their sobs echoing through the chamber as the jury delivered its verdict. Michelle Taylor, 21, and her sister Lisa, 19, stood side by side as they were found guilty of the murder of Allison Shaughnessy, a newly married woman whose life had ended in one of the most savage domestic killings the court had seen in years. Allison was just 21 years old when she was stabbed 54 times in her own home. The jury deliberated for more than 6 hours before reaching a unanimous decision. When the verdict was read, the weight of it seemed to crush the sisters instantly. Michelle clutched a small crucifix as tears streamed down her face, while Lisa, visibly shaken, had to be physically supported as prison officers led them away. One would begin life imprisonment immediately. The other, still a teenager, would start her sentence in youth custody. Their lives, like Allison's, were irrevocably changed. Mr. Justice Blofeld, delivering the mandatory life sentences, addressed the sisters with solemn finality. He spoke of Allison Shaughnessy as a young woman whose life was all before her, now reduced to a name in a murder trial. The brutality of the crime, he made clear, left no room for mercy under the law. At the heart of the case lay a toxic love affair. Michelle Taylor had become obsessed with John Shaughnessy, Allison's husband. She knew he would never leave his wife, no matter how intense her feelings became. But rather than retreat, Michelle convinced herself that Allison was the sole obstacle standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. In her diary, she fantasized about a future cleansed of Allison's existence, writing chilling words that later resurfaced in court. If she never existed, then maybe I could give everything I wanted to the man I love. That belief hardened into intent. On 3rd June 1991, Allison returned home from work, unaware that death was waiting for her behind the front door. Michelle attacked her in what prosecutors described as a frenzied assault, plunging a 5-inch knife into Allison's body again and again. Lisa was there too, not as a passive witness but as an encourager, urging her sister on as the attack unfolded. 54 stab wounds told the story of rage, jealousy, and cold determination. Afterward, the sisters moved swiftly to cover their tracks. They drove to the Churchill Clinic in Lambeth, deliberately placing themselves in public to create an alibi. They persuaded a friend, Jeanette Tapp, to lie to police and say the sisters had been with her all afternoon. Initially, she agreed, but when faced with charges of conspiracy, she withdrew her false statement, unraveling a key part of their defense. In a cruel twist, Michelle then returned to her role as the devoted lover. She helped John Shaughnessy arrange flowers at the clinic and later drove him home. When they entered the flat and Allison's body was discovered at the top of the stairs, Michelle performed what detectives later described as affected horror and shock. She cried, gasped, and clung to John, hiding the truth behind a mask of grief, but the illusion did not last. 2 months later, police arrested the sisters after forensic evidence placed them at the scene. Lisa's fingerprints were found on the front door of the flat. When confronted, she denied ever being there, repeating only, "I haven't done it." Michelle also denied committing the murder, but her statements betrayed her. She openly admitted that she hated Allison, that she was consumed by jealousy, and that she pitied women whose husbands wanted someone else. Those admissions, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, sealed their fate. As the verdict was announced, John Shaughnessy embraced Allison's grieving family. His words were simple but heavy with finality. Justice had been done, and Allison could finally rest in peace. Her mother, Breda Blackmore, spoke with quiet resolve. No sentence, she said, could ever atone for her daughter's death. Life imprisonment was not about years served. It was about the permanent stain of being known as murderers. The house in Brandon, Florida, appeared quiet on the night of September 2019, but inside its walls lay the aftermath of a violent and deeply unsettling act. Jonna Flores, a 48-year-old woman, was found dead on the living room couch, her life ended by a gunshot. The man who called for help was her husband, Ralph Wald. then 80 years old, a decorated Vietnam War veteran whose past already carried the shadow of another killing. Wald was the one who dialed 911. His voice, captured in the emergency call later released by prosecutors, sounded frantic as he told the dispatcher that he had found his wife unresponsive. He claimed confusion, fear, and desperation. To the untrained ear, it sounded like the panicked call of a husband discovering an unthinkable tragedy. But when police arrived, the scene suggested something far more troubling. A responding detective noted a critical detail: blood pooling around Jana's feet and ankles. It was not a medical emergency. It was a homicide scene. Jana had been shot, and the weapon used was not unfamiliar to investigators. In fact, it was chillingly familiar. The gun that ended her life was the same firearm that had been used 6 years earlier to kill Walter Conley, a 32-year-old man who had been secretly involved in an affair with Jana. That earlier shooting, in 2013, had already made headlines. Wald had admitted to firing the fatal shot, telling police and later a jury that he believed Conley was raping his wife inside their home. Acting, he said, on instinct and duty, he retrieved a gun and shot the intruder. During the trial, it emerged that Conley was not an attacker, but Jana's lover. Despite that revelation, the jury accepted Wald's claim that he believed he was protecting his wife. He was acquitted of murder. At the time, Wald stood before reporters and insisted his actions were justified. "All I wanted to do was protect my wife," he said. "I didn't know who it was. All I knew was somebody was fornicating with my wife." The couple appeared united afterward, clinging to one another as they left the courthouse, publicly vowing to stay together despite the exposure of betrayal and bloodshed. For years, they did. But beneath the surface, prosecutors would later suggest, the marriage may have remained haunted by the violence that had already claimed one life. The same gun stayed in the household. The same unresolved tensions lingered. And in 2019, that history resurfaced in the most devastating way possible. When Jana was found dead on the couch, investigators immediately took note of the parallels. Another shooting, the same weapon, the same man present. This time, however, there was no intruder, no claim of mistaken identity, no allegation of an attack in progress. The victim was Wald's wife herself. Authorities charged Wald with manslaughter, alleging that he was responsible for Jana's death. While details of the exact moments leading up to the shooting were not publicly reconstructed in full, the evidence pointed to a fatal encounter inside the home, one that ended with Jana collapsing on the couch as blood pooled beneath her. The scene stood in stark contrast to Wald's 911 call. The word unresponsive softened the reality. The physical evidence did not. Investigators could not ignore the pattern. A husband who had once killed his wife's lover, legally escaping punishment, now stood accused of killing the same woman he had claimed to protect. The connection between the two deaths transformed the case from a domestic tragedy into a chilling narrative of jealousy, violence, and unresolved rage. By the time Wald appeared in court years later, he was frail, brought in by wheelchair. His physical condition became part of the conversation, but the allegations remained unchanged. Prosecutors focused not on his age or health, but on the act itself, the moment a gun was fired, and a life was lost inside a home that had already been stained by death. What remained undeniable was this: two people connected to the same marriage died from the same gun, years apart. One was labeled a lover, the other a wife, and at the center of both deaths stood the same man, first hailed as a protector, later accused as a killer. The disappearance of Allison Clay in April 2012 unsettled Brisbane in a way few cases ever had. She was a familiar figure in her leafy Brookfield neighborhood, a 43-year-old mother of three whose life appeared stable, ordinary, and deeply rooted in family. When she vanished, the silence she left behind quickly turned into a citywide obsession, one that would slowly unravel into a story of betrayal, secrecy, and calculated violence. It began in the early hours of 20th April 2012. Just after 7:30 a.m., Allison's husband, Gerard Clay, called police to report her missing. He told officers she had last been seen the night before, leaving their Brookfield Road home wearing gray tracksuit pants and a dark top. Police treated it as a missing person case. There were no immediate signs of a crime, no screams heard, no blood visible. Allison seemed to have simply vanished into the night. Within days, the case drew intense public attention. A major incident room was established at Indooroopilly Police Station, and police appealed to the community for help. Allison's parents stood before cameras, pleading for information. Her mother's voice trembled as she begged the public to help bring her daughter home. The focus remained on hope that Allison was alive, confused, injured, or simply unable to return. Searches intensified. Police asked residents to comb through their properties for even the smallest clue. Emergency crews spread out across bushland, creeks, and roadside embankments. To visualize Allison's last known movements, police erected a mannequin outside her home, dressed in clothing similar to what she had reportedly worn the night she disappeared. The image became haunting, a silent stand-in for a woman who was rapidly becoming a symbol of collective fear. As days passed, optimism faded. 10 days after Allison was reported missing, a canoeist made a grim discovery beneath Colo Bridge, along a creek bank at Anstead, west of Brisbane. A woman's body lay partially concealed near the water. Police sealed off the area immediately. Though formal identification had yet to be completed, investigators already suspected the worst. When the body was confirmed as Allison's, the investigation shifted instantly. What had once been a missing persons case became a homicide investigation. Police acknowledged that they had long feared this outcome. Allison's family was informed. Their private grief now laid bare before a nation that had followed every development. The circumstances of her death raised disturbing questions. Her body had been deliberately moved and hidden, suggesting not an accident but an effort to conceal a crime. Investigators stated openly that the killing was not random and that the person responsible was someone Allison knew. Attention inevitably turned inward, toward the home she had shared, the marriage she had lived in, and the life she had been navigating behind closed doors. As police dug deeper, cracks appeared in the image of domestic normalcy. Evidence emerged of a troubled marriage, financial strain, and an extramarital affair Gerard Baden-Clay had been having with a co-worker. Friends and counselors revealed Allison had been aware of the affair and deeply affected by it. She had written in her journal about emotional pain, betrayal, and attempts to save her marriage. Physical evidence added to the growing unease. Scratches were photographed on Gerard Baden-Clay's face shortly after he reported Allison missing. He initially offered innocent explanations, but forensic experts later suggested the marks could have been caused by fingernails, possibly during a struggle. Witnesses also came forward with chilling recollections. Neighbors described hearing a woman scream on the night before Allison was reported missing. At the time, it had not seemed significant. In hindsight, it sounded like a moment of terror that had gone unanswered. Financial records painted another troubling picture. Baden-Clay was struggling with debt, owing hundreds of thousands of dollars to family and friends. Prosecutors later argued that Allison's life insurance policies, combined with the cost of divorce and the desire to continue his affair, formed a powerful motive. The theory that emerged was devastating. Allison had confronted her husband, an argument had erupted, and the conflict had turned violent. Whether intentional or not, Allison died during that confrontation. What followed, investigators believed, was a calculated attempt to cover it up, moving her body, misleading police, and staging a disappearance. Years of court battles would follow, but the core of the story remained unchanged. Allison Baden-Clay did not walk away from her life. She was killed, and her death was the violent end of a marriage unraveling under the weight of deceit, desperation, and silence. The morning of November 18, 2010, began like any other in the quiet Atlanta suburb of Dunwoody, Georgia. Parents hurried through drop-offs. Children clutched backpacks, and routines unfolded with comforting predictability. Then, in the space of a few seconds, the calm shattered. Russell Snyderman, a devoted father, was shot and killed in broad daylight as he dropped his young son off at daycare. The attack was swift, deliberate, and terrifyingly public, leaving witnesses stunned and a community reeling. Snyderman collapsed near his vehicle, fatally wounded. The gunman fled immediately, disappearing into traffic. By the time police arrived, Russell was dead. What initially appeared to be a senseless act of violence soon revealed itself as something far darker and more personal. Investigators quickly determined that this was no random shooting. The killer had waited, watched, and struck at a precise moment. Surveillance footage captured a silver minivan speeding away from the scene. That image would become a critical clue, one that ultimately led police to an unlikely suspect, Emmy Newman, a successful corporate engineer with no prior criminal record. Newman was a Georgia Tech graduate, a husband, a father of 3, and a senior manager at General Electric. On the surface, his life reflected stability and success, but beneath that polished exterior, prosecutors alleged, lay obsession, delusion, and a fixation that spiraled into murder. At the center of it all was Andrea Snyderman, Russell's wife, and Newman's subordinate at work. Prosecutors claimed Newman had been romantically involved with her, describing the relationship as an affair fueled by secrecy and emotional intensity. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, insisting their relationship was strictly professional. Still, investigators uncovered extensive communication between the two, painting a picture of emotional closeness that raised troubling questions. As police followed the trail, they discovered that Newman had rented a silver minivan matching the one seen fleeing the crime scene. 6 weeks after the killing, he was arrested. When confronted, Newman did not deny firing the gun. Instead, he offered an explanation that defied logic and reality. Newman claimed he had been driven by forces beyond his control. According to mental health examiners, Newman said he was being visited by supernatural beings. He described a demon whose voice sounded like Barry White and an angel who appeared in the form of Olivia Newton-John. The angel, he said, commanded him to kill Russell Snyderman in order to protect Andrea and her children. In Newman's mind, the shooting was not an act of jealousy or rage. It was a divine mission. Prosecutors painted a very different picture. They argued that Newman had become dangerously infatuated with Andrea, convinced that her husband was an obstacle standing between him and the life he wanted. Rather than accept rejection or reality, Newman allegedly nurtured his obsession until it metastasized into violence. The killing, they said, was premeditated, calculated, and fueled by desire masquerading as delusion. The murder shocked the public not only because of its brutality, but because of where and how it happened. A father was executed outside a daycare, in front of a place meant to represent safety and innocence. Children were nearby. Parents watched in horror. The normalcy of the setting made the crime even more disturbing. During the trial, Newman pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a defense that acknowledged the shooting but denied criminal responsibility. His attorneys conceded he had pulled the trigger, yet argued his mind was broken at the time. They suggested Andrea Snyderman had unknowingly or knowingly fed his delusions, encouraging him to believe that killing her husband was the only way to protect her family. The gun was in Hemi's hand, his lawyer told the jury, but the trigger was pulled by Andrea Snyderman. Andrea vehemently denied those claims. She maintained she had no knowledge of the shooting beforehand, and no role in encouraging violence. She was never charged in connection with her husband's death, though questions surrounding her involvement lingered long after the verdict. In the end, the jury rejected Newman's insanity defense, but acknowledged his mental instability. They found him guilty, but mentally ill, a verdict that recognized both culpability and psychological disturbance. The designation ensured Newman would receive mental health treatment, but behind prison walls. At sentencing, Newman addressed the court. His voice trembled as he apologized repeatedly, calling the killing a terrible tragedy. He expressed remorse, though, for many, his words rang hollow against the irreversible loss suffered by the Snyderman family. The judge sentenced Newman to life in prison without the possibility of parole.